Yes, good.
All right. Sorry. So the quote I've taken, no, you are not thinking, you're just being logical, was from Niels Bohr, a Nobel Prize winning scientist, who, when he was talking with his colleagues, when they came across this problem that was complex, it was unfamiliar, it was non-routine, it wasn't the normal thing that they came across, but it was something that they had knowledge about. What he found was that they couldn't think about it. They could be logical, they could go through the motions of applying their knowledge and know-how, but as far as he was concerned, they weren't thinking, they were just being logical. And of course what we're finding is that in a world where there's more and more complexity, in a world where we're being asked to deal with things that are unfamiliar and non-routine, this kind of thinking becomes more and more at a premium. So let me show you what I mean. What I've got here are 7 events that happened over a period of time. So Neil Armstrong working on the moon, Gough Whitlam being dismissed as PM, Elvis dying, the world's first ATM being installed, the first outbreak of Ebola, Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie being released, by which I mean the 4th Star Wars movie, and smallpox being eradicated as a disease. So what I'd like you to do, just for a minute or two, because not go very long, I want you to put these in chronological order. So with the people around you, the people that you came with, you sit near strangers, get to know the strangers around you, put these in chronological order. There's extra points for getting the dates right as well. Up to you. Alright, let's do another 10 seconds, so if you've not got it, get the earliest ones and the latest ones at least. Okay, you there? Alright, you are where you are. I'm going to interrupt. And let me do the big reveal. So there we go. So the first one, the earliest one, world's first ATM, then Neil Armstrong, walk on the moon, then Gough, then Ebola, Elvis and Star Wars were both in 1977. Well, actually 7. Smallpox was eradicated as a disease in 1979. So what? It wasn't a very good question. I mean, it was a pub quiz question, but it wasn't actually a very good question. What I was asking you to do was kind of a bit of recall, maybe a little bit of connecting to your thinking. But there's not much in there. There's not much in there that's complex and familiar or non-routine. It's a pretty kind of standard thing, building on something that we're pretty familiar with. And so let's think about these things in a different way. In things like, even in the Australian curriculum, the thing that we do in our schools now, what we're asking young people to do is not to remember lots of dates, but is to think about the historical stories in different ways in terms of, the evidence behind those things. I've said that the world's first ATM was the first thing there in 1967. You might ask me for my evidence for that. We might think about it in terms of the cause effect or the empathy or significance. In fact, let's do significance. What I'm going to get you to do now is to do take the same events, but put them in order of significance. So before we start, are there any questions that brings out?
I'm sorry, significant to what, us as a race, or
so Significant to whom is the question. So straight away, I've asked you a question that has generated questions, not just jumping in and doing it. You're asking me questions even about perspectives, about whose perspective. So the work that we do with the school, so let's go for an average 15-year-old in South Australia. I'm not sure there is an average 15-year-old in South Australia, but our imagining of whatever that might be, let's put some limits around it. The average 15-year-old in South Australia, put these events, let me go back to the events, put these events in order of significance. Over to you. Okay, I'm going to stop you, I'm going to break in. Thank you. So, we're not very long, and I just want to give you a taste of the difference in thinking. So, same content, but different thinking. So, let me show you the order of significance for the average South Australian. Yeah, of course I can't do it, can I? I can't do it. There isn't an answer like there's an answer to this. Really, when I'm asking those questions about significance, the answer is, well, it depends. And exactly as you were asking, well, to who? And all those other questions that we've got, well, it depends on a whole host of things. And of course, for most of us, when we're thinking creatively, when we're thinking problem solving, when we're coming across those complex, unfamiliar and non-routine things, the answer is always, it depends. And Bertrand Russell, in this book from the 20s, The Education and the Good Life, put it this way. He said that it's dangerous when you're thinking it's a dangerous error to confound truth with a matter of fact. Because our life isn't governed by facts. But we've also got those hopes. And the kind of truthfulness that sees nothing but facts is a prison for the human spirit. And so when we interact with each other, if it's all about knowing stuff, if we're at school and it's all about knowing stuff, I'm going to say this is that prison for the human spirit. Pub quizzes are great if you know stuff. And if you know nothing, pub quizzes are dismal. You know, it really is a prison for the human spirit if you don't know anything. And yet, over here, when I start to talk about the questions where the answer is it depends, you know, I'm getting closer to what Bo was talking about, what his mates were not thinking. I'm getting closer to finding our truth rather than there being a matter of fact that there is some kind of answer out there. And if I go back to these events and, you know, how we might put them in order and those sorts of things, when I ask this question about, well, it depends, that's essentially an ungoogleable question. When I ask you to put them in order, in chronological order, who got the phone out and Googled it? Because we should have done, right? That's the most efficient way to answer that question. You just get your phone out and Google it. That's what you should do. But when I ask you a question, when our interaction with each other demands an it depends answer, it's essentially ungoogleable. And so, when we think about how we're developing that in each other and how they're developing that in young people, we might talk about, you know, what we call this problem-solving approach. This is a textbook, a Year 7 textbook. It's about plant and animal systems. It's got a problem-solving approach. So this book, great, we're getting our kids to be creative, to do problem-solving. Problem-solving approach. Your problem is to produce a diagram of the human body, a correct diagram of the human body, showing the digestive, respiratory, excretory, and reproductive systems. What's the problem? There's no problem in that. It's an activity. How are we going to do the problem? Oh, we can make a collage, or have plastic sheets, or pop-up books. Brilliant. I've still not come across the problem. And how do you start? Read the textbook. Wow. And so I can Google it. Diagram of human systems. Look at that. Google images. There they all are. You know, I could get that one and cut and paste it and give it to the teacher. There's one with some text on it, brilliant. That'll be even better, because I can just copy that down. Fantastic. And if you think about it, what have the students learned? What have any of us learned when we go and, just get this information? And people say, well, they know stuff now, don't they? Well, do they? Do we? It's clear that when we're passive in the way that we interact with our the information, that we really don't learn it. We don't even recall it. There's a big review that came out a year or two ago by a researcher called Domlosky, and he looked at all the ways in which we interact with information and study and read. And the two that came out to be the most ineffective were rereading stuff and highlighting, which is all the things I do when I read research papers. And so changing the way that I interact with information based on this evidence has changed the way that I think about how I'm going to get information. Let me show you this research. I haven't put the reference on this, and I apologise for that. But what they did in this research was they gave people statements like, the hungry man got into the car, and asked them to read the sentence. Some people they gave statements like, the hungry man got into the car, and it had a reason with it to go to the restaurant. And other people they gave statements like, the hungry man got into the car and asked them to explain why he might have got into the car. When people came back after a period of time, they'd read a number of statements like this. When they came back after a period of time and were asked questions like, who got into the car? About 37% of the cohort could remember that it was the hungry man who got into the car. Similar, in fact, the same percentage, coincidentally, could remember that it was hungry man when they were given a reason. But the people who've been asked to generate a reason why the hungry man got into the car, almost twice as many remembered that it was the hungry man who got into the car. So this changed the way in which we interact with information, being asked to generate an idea. Now, for me, the way that I put this into practice is when I'm reading a research paper, I'll stop myself and ask, what do I think is coming next? What methodology did I think they used? What conclusion do I think that they came to? So I start to predict what might be coming next. Because essentially, these are Googleable questions. The information is there, and I'm passively reading the information. And essentially, this is an ungoogleable question. Because there's this question, why he might have, well, I could go and get somebody else's reason, but what we're asking for is my reason, me to generate a reason why he might have got into the car. So what I'm doing is I'm shifting my thinking from being passive to being active. I'm shifting from being Googleable, where somebody, something is telling me information, to me asking, suggesting reasons. Going from knowing stuff, a quiz, to suggesting possibilities. And you can see where I'm going now with this thinking and this change of thinking, the change in which I interact with information, and how that might be related to creativity. How it might be related to the nature of the challenges that we pose ourselves and pose each others to change our thinking. And about the way in which we do research. Clearly research isn't gathering information, but the way in which we do research and the way that research might shape our thinking. And so when we do that with the kids, back to these year 7 and 8 kids who are using this textbook, what we did was, we put this in the hands of the kids. We said, let's ask some what-if questions. Let's not do what they said. Let's ask some what-if questions. We've got some interesting questions from around the place. What if this, what if that? Then one kid, cheeky kid, says, what if you didn't have a bum hole? Great question. So the other kids go, right, let's do that. And the other kids go, oh, what if you didn't have a bum hole? Oh, God. And they're looking through the textbook, going, what if you didn't have a bum hole? What do you think might happen? And another kid says, you'd be like a starfish. And everybody looks. Yeah, you'd be like a starfish. The kind of nutrients, it goes into its mouth and then digests it, and then like the waste products, like the poo, that comes back out of its mouth again. Oh, God, it's just going to be But as a starting point, as an entry point into them learning about systems, about these systems in the human body, that starfish story was never coming out of this. But that knowledge that we've got, using that knowledge in a different way, transferring that knowledge, taking this old knowledge and making something new with it, was happening in that classroom when we changed the question. It's happening in the tea room when we do research, when we ask these kinds of questions. When we ask these questions where the answer is, it depends. And I was looking at this, reading this article about the history of medical education. And it talked about how in the 13th to the 16th century, the most common way of doing education was using textbooks. Great. And they were using the Hippocrates, Galen, all those kind of classics. But what they would do is they would work through the key texts line by line, reading them aloud and thinking, oh yeah, no, not much has changed. But they would get the students to dispute the propositions taken from the text. So, which is the most vital organ for life? Is it the heart or the brain? It depends. So even in the 13th century, medical education in the 13th century was asking questions of creativity questions. It depends. How could the heart be more crucial than the brain? How could the brain be more crucial than the heart? And so there's a difference between what we call here kind of solving a problem and problem solving. When we solve a problem, when we do a pub quiz, a problem or something like that, a maths problem, what we're being asked to do is to put all the pieces that already exist, my knowledge, my know-how, the information in the question, and put it together and narrow them down and put them together in a particular order so that I've completed the picture and I've got the answer. And I want to suggest that our lives are never like that. Our working lives, our cultural lives, social lives, are never like that. What we actually do is we start with a point where we've got a problem. We go, well, what would you do about this? And you do this divergent thinking, where you're thinking about the possibilities, the ways in which you might respond to that. And of course, when you get to that point, then you stop, and then you start to do this convergent thinking, working towards an answer, working towards a response. And so what at school we probably call problem solving really isn't. It's only the second half of it. Real problem solving, the problems that we have, we've at least got these two parts, where we're saying, what if, it depends, and then running towards a response. And there's probably another step in here where we're switching from one to the other. Because these two ways of thinking, I'll show you some brain images of course in a second, these two ways of thinking are different ways of thinking. And so we have to switch from one to another. If we just did, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, and this, and this, and this, there are all these possibilities. That would be as disabling as knowing nothing and not being able to come to an answer, because it stops us coming to an answer, because it would create too many possibilities. So at some point we've got to switch and go back. And so that might take, particularly in we find in younger people, some metacognition, some thinking about our thinking. Stop thinking this way and start thinking that. And of course it's not just one cycle, we go through this over and over again, and of course that's what people like Bohr and Russell would do, what those thinkers would do. They would do that divergent thinking followed by the convergent thinking. I wasn't sure where this was in on that, I'm still not sure. Let's not, we might come back to it. But if we go back to this model of divergent thinking and convergent thinking, of course, that's one model that we can use to think about creativity. And so definitions about creativity for decades have talked about a process that's novel and is useful. A type of thinking that produces something that's got originality as well as some sense of value that says think. And Bob Sternberg, in his book, The Creativity Handbook, talks about it as being the ability to produce works. It's an ability now to produce work that is novel and appropriate. So we've got these two steps, the novel and appropriate, the original and value. So the novel, think about the possibilities, that divergent thinking, and then switching to see if it's appropriate, to see if it meets the need that we have. And Rebecca Solnit, a writer from New York, talked about how she was quoting Oppenheimer when she said that scientists live always at the edge of mystery, the boundary of the unknown. And of course that made me think about this space here in which we're operating between the two. And that what scientists do is that they transform the unknown into the known and they haul it in like fishermen. And it's artists who get you out into that dark sea. And I couldn't disagree more. Because clearly what we see is a scientist who starts here and hauls the unknown in like a fisherman, he's only doing that second step. And an artist who gets out into that dark sea, just as the first step, he's lost. where the artist goes from being a craftsperson, craftsman, craftswoman, into an artist is when they're doing the interpretation, when their intent comes through, when they're asking, does this have meaning? How might people interpret this? What am I trying to represent? Have I really represented that in that way? Am I getting people to feel the things that I wanted them to feel and respond in the way that I want or the way that they want? But still there is this divergent thinking towards that value in some way. And so whatever we do, whether we're artists, scientists, whatever we do, in our everyday response to those it depends questions, we're starting here, I think, and we're going into that divergent thinking and then switching and going into that convergent thinking. And without both of those steps, one way or another, we're lost in our thinking. And we can see this in lots of different ways. People have tried to probe this in a number of ways. This is some research from Paul Howard-Jones at Bristol and Sarah Jane Blakemore, some of you might know for her work in particularly around adolescence and their thinking. And what they did was they did some divergent story generation. And what they found was when they asked people to create a story using a few lines, and they might give them a few words, something like, let's say, ant, hill, and water, and to make up a story. When they asked them to make a creative story, or asked them to make up an uncreative story, what they started to see was different activity. So if we take the uncreative story generation away from the activity in the brain where we're doing creative story generation, this is what we're left with here. You can see the front of the brain and the back of the brain and so on. And so there's a couple of things to note. The first thing is that it's not like this. That it's not left brain thinking or right brain thinking, that somehow the left brain is the logical part of the brain and the right brain is the creative part of the brain. I mean, it's certainly true that we do have functional modules which, if you knock them out, that early research where people got brain damage in one side of the brain or another, they had an accident, some part of the brain got smashed in, and they would lose some function. And it's telling us that there are bits of the brain that are necessary for creative thinking, analogical thinking, or more analytical thinking. But certainly not that activity is going on in the left or the right side of the brain. Or even worse, that there are left brain thinkers and right brain thinkers somehow. But what they did start to see was that you could see that on the left side of the brain, there were parts of the brain becoming active that were active when we do things like word association. On the right side of the brain, there were parts of the brain becoming active when we do things like story generation and distance associations. One of the other things it looked like was lying. Because when we're lying, we're being very creative. Because when you're lying, what you've got to do is, you've got this working memory load, you've got to hold in your head all the possibilities from this lie that you've just made and all the connections and all the things you've got to keep track of. And when they went through, they did a number of steps, and then they got to this final point where they had asked people to be creative and uncreative. They'd asked people to look at related words like ant, hill, and water, or unrelated words. I'm trying to generate unrelated words. Generating unrelated words is really hard because, of course, as soon as I think of a word, the next word that I think of is a related word to that one. But they asked them to come up with stories that had 3 unrelated words in. And when they took away all of those different conditions from each other, what they found was that we were left with this one particular set of activity in the brain. And that particular activity in the brain was what they considered to be considered to correlate with this kind of stringent monitoring, the checking. And so the creativity, the most creative condition that they found, where they'd had unrelated words, so you've really got to squeeze these words together, and they'd asked people to be creative. The most creative condition that they found had in it this stringent monitoring. It wasn't coming up with the ideas that was the problem. It was the making sure that the ideas actually made any sense that was the challenge. And we see that in a whole host of places. In education, where we've found with students who've got a fixed mindset, so students who think about themselves, their intelligence as something that's fixed and you really can't change. So if you can't do something, I just can't do it, I'm just not smart enough. and kids have a growth mindset. And for those kids, they think about their intelligence as something that's malleable, something that can change, something that can develop over time. And what we find is when we look at the potentials in their brains, the electrical activity in their brain, when they're doing problems that they're getting right, there's essentially no difference in the activity in the brain. But when they look at the way in which they respond to getting questions wrong, the kids with the growth mindset have got much more activity in the brain, let's call it, when they get something wrong. And so what the researchers concluded was, if you take this with some other past findings, what we see is that we get an increased likelihood to learn from mistakes when we've got this online error awareness working for us, when we're doing this checking, when we're doing this responding to something that we've not seen before, getting it wrong, and responding to that and learning from it is the same as in that creativity when we've got this online checking occurring. I'm going to move on. Do that thing where we're going, so here's a bit of neuroscience, isn't it convincing, let's rush on and talk about something else. But what we see is that when in those two steps that I've talked about, the generate step and the evaluate step, divergent thinking followed by the convergent thinking, the only thing I want you to take from this, the only thing I think this actually tells us, is that it's different. That you've got that different thinking going on in that generative phase compared to that evaluative phase. And what the researchers in this paper talked about is how that particular evaluation, that particular analysis step in creativity is unusual. Because you're evaluating your own stories, you're evaluating the things that you've come up with yourself. So what we're seeing, I think, emerging from the research is that the critical part to helping us to be creative is being generative, yes, but it's that online checking that becomes crucially important as well. That stopping and thinking, that getting hold of your thoughts and not just making stuff, not just being generative, but switching and starting then to do this narrowing down towards the answer. Put these things in chronological order is essentially just that second step. But when I asked you to put them in order of significance, I was asking you to do an it depends, and do that first step and then that second step. And we're seeing this now happening in schools across South Australia. There's one of the teachers in Port Augusta, Flinders View Primary School, and what they were doing was the kids would be making nets, so you know those flat cubes, and they cut them out and fold them up and stick them together and make a cube and they colour them in and hang them up. And the teacher was thinking about the creativity, was thinking about the challenge, was thinking about that online checking and realising that it really wasn't there. And so she asked the kids, what did you think of that lesson where they folded up these pieces of paper to make the cubes? And the kids said, it was brilliant. We did sticking, we did colouring, we made those cubes, it was great. And there's no maths and no creativity.